everyone. Today is December 11, 2025, and we are very happy that I could have Matt Ehret, who's always been with us, and he's always been in many other podcasts because he's a fantastic geopolitical analyst and historian, and he's an author of many books. And as Monty and I were talking before the show, we couldn't catch up. But it's very good that we have someone like Matthew and his wife Cynthia. And was Matthew just doesn't write articles in Substack, but he also has published so many books. And later, I'll just let Matthew speak. This year, how many books has he published? And of course, he also, with collaboration with Jason Dahl, has made many documentary films or video clips that one of them actually made it all the way to Russia. And so again, later, Matthew, feel free to share this film, and also feel free to share your experience in visiting Russia. So and as I was telling Monty, Matthew is a wealth of knowledge that I don't know what else to ask him to talk about. But I thought that since it's the end of the year, it's December now, and I would like him to speak like, a professor with checking the year-end performance card of our country. This could be like an end-year report, as most of us are really asking a serious question: is our nation finally moving in the right direction or drifting further off course? And of course, maybe many will say, oh, it's the worst year, the worst president. But those who voted for him could not imagine that if he isn't the president as of this moment. So there's no comparison for the alternative. So tonight, historian and geopolitical analyst Matt Ehret will really, again, help us deep dive into.
Can you guys hear? Hello?
Can you hear me?
Uh-oh, I just lost the sound. I can't hear anything.
But we can hear you.
Yes, Matt, I was just considering this national security strategy because a lot of people are very excited about it, thinking Trump is, it's a new day for America with America first and everything, and it sounds good. A lot of window dressing and flowering up on it, but others are seeing a little more sinister intent where it could go either way. I agree that it basically looks like with Europe and NATO, America's recognized that they're overextended with all of these wars and commitments militarily. And I think it finally dawned on Trump that in Ukraine, it's a lost cause, where they're losing horribly with the encirclement of a number of cities now. I think it finally got through to him that he's got to find a way to exit. So I think that inspired his renegotiating with Russia on this. But what concerns me a little bit is this shift in Venezuela with the national security strategy and this so-called Trump corollary, what they're calling the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. But I think it's really a Teddy Roosevelt corollary. Teddy Roosevelt really usurped the intent of John Quincy Adams and the original Monroe Doctrine, which was basically put in place to protect the American continents from threats from without, from recolonization and so forth. And it's been reinterpreted to mean America is going to have dominion in South America. And in particular, of note in the national security document, it talked about that, for instance, there's a quote that any country who owns or controls any strategic assets in South America will be basically, that'll be considered a national security threat. In other words, given the Venezuela treatment, sanctions, threat, regime change, and war, if a foreign country comes in and owns any part of interest that the United States considered national interest. So I think it's very suspect. So I'll leave it with that.
I agree with your assessment, and you don't want to. I mean, nobody wants to make necessarily absolute judgments for good or for bad, of which there are many that we've both seen from people who are of an absolutist standpoint, that this is purely a vicious new rebranding of an evil empire. And then you've got the other extreme that portrays this as being this great patriotic restoration of nationalism and rejection of hegemony. And I don't think either one, we can't necessarily latch on to either one, although I think being aware of what you just said is very important, because it is underdefined. Is there more to work with, with this strategic outlook that's been presented than there was in the previous 30-year strategic outlook of the United States that pretty much had a more absolutist end of history orientation? Yeah, there's more to work with, but at the same time, there are these Trojan horses and toxic concepts that have been baked into it, one of which being, as you pointed out, this Teddy Roosevelt corollary rehash, which took, and most people don't know this, you're one of the few people, Monty, who is familiar with this very important fact in history, which is that the Monroe Doctrine itself is often blamed for being the cause of U.S. imperial expansionism over the Western Hemisphere, but that's not true. That's not true at all. The thing that justified the expansionism and turned America into this empire under especially the figure of Teddy Roosevelt, like there were obviously pushes to do this under Polk and under Pierce and things earlier, but they were very short-lived. The patriotic faction within America was always able to undermine and subdue this other more virulent, racist, Anglo-American orientation, which only finally got a big success with Teddy Roosevelt. And when McKinley was murdered, Teddy's entire nest of deep state operatives took the helm of government and really latched the USA into a new trajectory that the USA had formerly rejected, with his corollary that mandated that all of a sudden it was in U.S. strategic interest to not only keep European oligarchical influences out of the Americas, which was formerly the Monroe Doctrine, was basically, we need to keep the Americas free of influence by these Byzantine oligarchical intelligence operations and banking and all of these Jesuitical things that were causing the U.S. or the Americas to be destroyed from within and to fall into these forever wars between each other. So that's what James Monroe, but really it was John Quincy Adams, who was the key architect of that insight, introduced that policy. That's good. Keep empires out of the Americas. Let this create a space where republics of Paraguay and Uruguay and all of the republics can properly develop real economies. And under the best of times, when this faction represented by John Quincy Adams emerged to power, whether it was under Lincoln or earlier with William Harrison or Zachary Taylor or later on McKinley, who was really the last deep self-conscious representative of that tradition, America was always assisting economically, much in the similar way that China has demonstrated its position with weaker countries around the world, and especially around their borders in East Asia, West Asia, even in Africa. So that was the American general idea, was help nations have advanced technological power, help to train the next generation of engineers in these countries that would then be able to build and become the leaders of their society, so that you're not just giving them aid, you're providing them the means to support themselves. And that idea was completely crushed by this Teddy Roosevelt big stick, walk around, speak softly and carry a big stick philosophy, that it involved the expansion of the U.S. military, the United Fruit operations, all of these corporations that people like Smedley Butler, the general who got tired of being a whore, a puppet for big sugar, big oil, the Rockefeller machinery. He got tired of being this imperial battering ram, and he came out and blew the whistle in the late 20s, usefully so, and even exposed a Wall Street business coup against Roosevelt. But he exposed all of this stuff. So it had been already going on from, Teddy Roosevelt's earliest moments all the way up until the emergence of Franklin Roosevelt and the Great Depression that he pulled us out of. But that being said, the danger right now is that there are seeds, toxic seeds, that seem like they are being planted in the narrative space, as well as just the positioning of this new U.S. strategy around what might easily devolve quickly into a restoration of this nefarious Teddy Roosevelt doctrine. As you pointed out, Venezuela, the messaging that's been set into the zeitgeist, which is based on pure lies, and that, as much as I want to support the patriotic MAGA groups, and I do support them, but as much as I support that, I can't ignore the fact that Trump and his inner core are doing an immense amount of damage by spreading lies about fentanyl coming in from Venezuela and not Colombia. Sorry, they don't even bring up Colombia. Colombia is the actual source of cocaine and many of the drug problems, but they don't bring that up. They bring up Venezuela, which has no role to play in fentanyl. If anything, the drugs that we're seeing coming in is from U.S. proxy states like Ecuador, like Peru. Colombia is a big source of that. Fentanyl, and which is purely grown in labs, it's not even grown in a geographic area per se, seems to have much more to do with laboratories that are organized by that very same global crime syndicate with its branches in India. Very, very, and there's actually I forgot the name of the presenter, very tired, who was just going through a wonderful exposition. It'll come to me after, of the actual role of the Indian deep state in colluding with
Asher.
Oh, it wasn't him. It was actually another guy who had worked with the Gray Zone. And my mind is just not capturing his name for some reason. I was just listening to it this morning, and he was on Redacted last night. And I was just listening to the interview he gave with Redacted, just going through his findings. It'll come to me. I'll promise it'll come to me.
Yeah,
Asher, I didn't look at him.
Yeah.
Oh, Uwe Alschner?
Yes, Uwe Alschner.
Oh, Uwe Alschner also, yeah, he's a great researcher, and he's also amplified this fellow's research in a great way. But yeah, anyway, it doesn't matter. But so yeah, you've got the narrative space being set up to almost justify another regime change in Venezuela. Some people say that Trump is just playing the game, but isn't really planning on following through. I don't know that. It looks like a lot of effort's been put into legitimizing, the NED, CIA front woman, Maria Cuchado. Did I say Cuchado or Machado? I've just all of a sudden my name Machado. You're right. I don't want to say Cuchado. Machado. But so there's a lot of work to legitimize her, give her Nobel Prizes. There's a lot of narrative seeding to brainwash Americans who are now really in hysterics that China and Venezuela are out to destroy America by bringing in fentanyl. Not true at all. And that's a big part of the security doctrine too, is that, it's good. There's good things. We can't ignore those good things. Like Russia is not treated for the first time as the existential threat to the United States. That's good. That there's a new language that recognizes that Europe has to do much more to resolve this conflict, and that Russia is not the enemy of the West. There's even it eviscerates the European Union quite nicely, and I appreciate that, making the point that in 20 years, I think there's language to the effect that Europe as we see it today won't even be recognizable. But it really puts the blame of the ongoing never-ending war in Ukraine on these Euro technocrats and the thing that came in before Trump. So, to a certain degree, that creates a space to begin to develop some positive relations with Russia, hopefully. But again, when it comes to China, China is still treated like a trade nemesis of the United States. They never say that China is an enemy. That's good that they don't use that language in the 33 pages or whatever it was, but they frame it as an economic competitor, and that's fine. But then you're like, okay, if you really want true economic competition, then doing the next thing, which is calling all, and it's pretty much China when America says all foreign investments in the Western Hemisphere are pretty much up for grabs to be reconfiscated, is what they're implying in my mind, by the U.S. That's specifically China they're talking about. And because China's invested in dozens and dozens of major ports, infrastructure, rail development through Peru and Bolivia, and they've developed energy grids galore over the last 13, 14 years. And there's a lot of great good that's happened economically because of the quality of the investments that China has engaged in, with which the U.S., which has control and has had control since the earliest days of the Cold War, of the major military infrastructure controlling all of South America and Central America. It's called Southcom. And if you go to Southcom, you could just see like the U.S. military has been running something like 77 bases throughout all of the Americas, managing since the days of Condor, Operation Condor, and even before that, the actual means by which immigration flows enter into the Americas and move between American countries. It's not China that has that capability to oversee and manage that type of behavior, or even drug flows, narcotics, and other things. And back in the day, in the 1990s, 60 Minutes, you guys have probably seen this clip that's gone viral now, of the 1993 60 Minutes, interview. In 60 Minutes, I guess mainstream media still had a little bit more freedom to speak the truth, was clearly going through the role of the CIA in driving drug flows from Venezuela that they controlled entirely into the United States. And that was on 60 bloody minutes, and they're probably just only touching on a fraction of it. So the U.S. has been under the Green Berets, under this whole military intelligence operation, which is still in place. The culprits, or the thing that's latched onto the U.S., let's say it that way, to differentiate the real USA from this evil thing. There's been the very same agency which seems to want to rehash some of the worst traditions of Teddy Roosevelt and Albert Pike, whose statue has also been reinstated a few months ago as the only Confederate KKK founder whose statue is permitted in the capital of the United States. That's what's been restated in my mind, knowing Pike's role, not just as a Confederate general, as the head of the Grand Master of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, but also as the architect of the Ku Klux Klan, and also the founder of the Golden Circle that I know, Monty, you've studied in depth, the empire of the Golden Circle, which was to be the Confederate empire that was supposed to be an expansionist empire, had the Confederates succeeded in their endeavors to break up the Union and to become their own thing. The fact that that statue was created in 1902, overseen by Teddy Roosevelt as sort of a mission statement announcing his Roosevelt corollary originally. That's when he put up the Albert Pike statue. Then it was taken down in the days of woke. But the fact that it's being reinstated just a few months ago, I think, is almost like a reassertion for those in the know of what this sort of thing means, of the Roosevelt, the Teddy Albert Pike traditions of the Golden Circle, which does dovetail a little bit with the unfortunate program put forth by Elon Musk's grandfather, or at least that he was a promoter of. I can't say he created it, but this idea of a North American technate, which Joshua Haldeman, the grandfather of Elon Musk, was promoting, that would be modeled effectively on the principles of apartheid South Africa, as Elon Musk's grandfather did go to apartheid South Africa, where he called it the freest place in the world, against the Jew bankers that he said had to be destroyed, and only South Africa had the moral fitness to do that, which is why he went there, just at the core of of apartheid. But if you look at what that was, that's like a hardcore fascist, like Nazi operation that divided the society into little districts with like little identity cards based on your genetic makeup and whether you are a full white or Black Zulu or mulatto, or what degree you are in between, that gave you different privileges based on your genetic makeup, to be permitted to have certain jobs, to go to certain restaurants or bathrooms, or being allowed to even venture from your district into another district. That's how South Africa was wired under apartheid, which again was the model that people like Elon Musk's grandfather wanted the world, a liberated world, to be managed by that type of structure. So this is the guy who's setting up the North American Technate for Technocracy Incorporated, which Elon Musk, it's not like that's just a quirk or some trivial factoid of Elon Musk's peculiar heritage. It's like Elon himself has openly spoken about his belief in restoring like a technate he's called it, we need a technate for Mars. He's utilized very similar naming protocols that the membership of his grandfather's technate would have for the membership. He's utilized those protocols for his own child, the X1Z kid, right? So you've got to, let alone the fact that the entire operating system of a society run by unelected engineers, that would be the scientifically managed system under effectively eugenics with a promise of industrial growth forever, but no actual means of carrying out that promise. The promise was never true because they always believed, as we saw with the leading figures within the Technocracy Incorporated Bible. They actually had a Bible. It was basically it's an atheistic organization with a yin yang symbol as their sort of pseudo swastika. It was a fascist organization, but in their study guide, as they called it, they enshrine the second law of thermodynamics and entropy as a core fundamental principle that would organize the scientific class that would manage the post-capitalist, post-democratic world that this technate wanted to bring into being, with a new set of elites that would emerge out of the fires of the old elites that had wasted away and served their purpose under the days of rapacious colonization, a la Smedley Butler. So, there was a configuration of this thing, and I do see it tied to a similar Rosicrucian operation. Unfortunately, when you look at Elon Musk's grandfather, this guy was tied to the occult on several key data points, one of which being the figure of A.R. Oraj, who was the personal secretary to Gurdjieff, and who ran a theosophical review that had been initiated by Annie Besant, who was the head of the Fabian Society, called New Age Magazine. And in it, they published such writings of Aleister Crowley, other occultists, in this New Age magazine to call for a new age of Lucifer and new age of Aquarius. And the fact that Gurdjieff was the personal assistant or that Oraj, the personal assistant to Gurdjieff, who also served as counterintelligence and a spy, as well as being a general guru for a new age unto his own right. And his theosophical, jargon and cosmology is very influential today. If people don't realize it is. But this is what Joshua Haldeman was directly affiliated with when he became the head of the Social Credit Party of Canada, because the Social Credit Party of C.H. Douglas, a British military figure, very ambiguous, but who was himself a very close assistant and writer for New Age magazine. And it was actually A.R. Oraj who dubbed that new system of economic theory that Douglas created with social credit. He gave it that name, social credit, in 1921. So you have this whole occult network that's trying to create a new theory, and they're marketing it to Hitler. They're quite persuaded that Hitler, who has an affinity to their thinking, because Hitler also has, direct back channels with the Aleister Crowley. Now, Aleister Crowley directly through Aleister Crowley's lieutenant at the Argentum Astrum Lodge that he created in 1907. And one of his key figures, who's a British J.C.R. Fuller, he's a British general, currently still studied in military colleges of England and the USA today, who innovated tank warfare. That J.C.R. Fuller was a high-level open priest of the Crowley Argentum Astrum Lodge. He was also Sir Oswald Mosley's second in command. Sir Oswald Mosley being the Fabian Society head of the British Union of Fascists, the British Hitler, who was a member of Parliament, and he was going to be the British Nazi. And his second in command, who he had said he was going to make the Defense Secretary of England, had the British elites then accepted Hitler's offers to have a joint Anglo-German control of the world. J.C.R. Fuller would have been the defense secretary of England. But J. Sarah Fuller was also in and out of Germany, Nazi Germany, serving and providing Crowleyite back channels with Hitler and his inner command of hard occultists from the Thule Society. So this is the sort of thing that was there in the 30s. That's what, if you look at it in all of its fundamentals, that's what Albert Pike was deep. Like read Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma, and you'll see it. Like it's deep occultism that's highly self-consciously situated within this deep, occult Templar Gnostic mystery religious order that Pike knew that his masters desired to bring about out of the ashes of former nation states and cultures that had become viable by rejecting that system of evil that had run amok during the medieval ages, the Crusades, which we finally said no to the dark plague, to the Black Plague, to the forever wars, to the controlled stupidity and depopulation of the Middle Ages. We finally were able to organize around some incredibly beautiful souls who had a much better and more true and beautiful idea of humankind and what God was and what God created, who brought us out of that crisis. And that's what these Satanists have been working through through Pike, through Teddy Roosevelt, through Hitler, and I think through Elon Musk's grandfather, and that whole Silicon Valley occult apparatus, which today is, surprising people because you have Peter Thiel talking about the Antichrist as being tied into this belief in self-conscious machinery that will demonically replace us, that it's part of their religious rebranding of what they think computer and computing systems are designed to do. So it's a religious thing for them. It's not just simply a way to make money or a way to even manage power. And the last thing here I'll just say before I throw it off to one of you guys is Oswald Mosley's grandson is still in play. If you look at who's the head of Palantir UK, the CEO of Palantir UK is, I think his name is Louis Mosley. I think it's Louis, but it's a Mosley. And he's the grandson of Sir Oswald Mosley. So you have these second, third generation characters from that attempt to create a one world government, new world order back in the 1930s. They're still in play. It's a multi-generational thing with the assets who are still being utilized, carrying out a similar design. Now, does that mean that we're fucked? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means people have to be aware of how this game is wired because they failed the last time they tried to get this done. It's not like they tried to fail. They tried to succeed and then they failed. And then why did they fail? Because you had the type of quality of human thinking expressed by an Abraham Lincoln and his network, both in the United States, but also in Russia, and in China, where you had figures around what became later on the 100-Day Reformers, and then later on that banner was taken up by the likes of Sun Yat-sen. Afterwards, the McKinley faction in Russia was very, very strong in Germany and in France, and they were able to coordinate to a certain important way to ensure that this new hellish age of Horus was not initiated in the 1860s when it was planned to be, or again when it was attempted once more in the 1930s. And it was prevented because you had people who did the human thing, right, under Franklin Roosevelt and also his allies within Russia and within China and within other parts of the world with de Gaulle, who were able to coordinate in a confused way. They didn't know everything, but they knew enough and they had enough access to their souls, their conscience, and their knowledge of the principles of their history that they didn't want to allow their civilizations to go into this sacrificial cutting block. So they were able to do certain things that we can study today to prevent the New World Order from succeeding. And so because we have that precedent, because we have nations that give me a lot of hope, because I followed China very closely, I've mapped out their deep state structures, their traitors, but I've also mapped out through a lot of the assistance by people like great EIR researchers like Mike Billington, who did fantastic work sort of setting the stage to appreciate the battles over, natural and unhealthy, unnatural cultural dynamics within China's history that gives us a better appreciation into what this Confucian Renaissance actually has been, what's behind it, what's behind their economic strategies, which actually, like I said, has a lot to do with the best displays of what America was when America was good and viable. That's the torch that's been picked up by China. There's similar patriotic forces as well as bad people too, but there's very patriotic, good people inside of Russia wielding influence, coordinating with China. In Iran, you got a similar thing. And I'm hoping that patriots in America can learn to do the thing that's lacking in this security doctrine, which overall, it has more to work with. There's useful things in it. But at the same time, there's a lacking of any type of idea of cooperating for win-win cooperation with other nations like China or other. It's just not there. And without that, there's no way to heal from the type of self-mutilation the U.S. permitted to have happen on itself since the murder of JFK. So you need to have that spirit reawakened of cooperation, anti-entropic development, and that's basically my fancy way of saying win-win cooperation. But it's the same gist. So that's my 2 cents. Yeah.
So Matthew, Monty, just one thing for Matthew. Since you said all of this very dark truth, and we did choose who we elected, who we put in the American leadership. Do you see anything at all with how the leadership from Trump and down on the lower positions, do you think they have an understanding of what you just shared to us?
No, they have no clue. The better people have no clue. But there are better people. Now, I'm not going to go into details because some of what I'm saying, I'm hoping to challenge people who might be confused or might not be on the better side of things to maybe, I'm hoping maybe some of what I'm saying has some nonlinear effects out there and gets people to do some soul searching. Monty, I don't know. What was on your mind?
Well, Matt, yeah, you struck a lot of notes with me, and one thing that, in particular, aside from the Monroe Doctrine being thoroughly usurped, another principled element of our history from the 19th century was this idea of manifest destiny, which goes right along with it. In other words, the idea not of what has become is this idea of imposing America dominion over these other countries, particularly in the Americas. But the idea was the image of man, this idea of uplifting humankind, this idea of spreading our wealth and railway development, infrastructure development, uplifting, in other words, America being a shining light on the hill. And what manifest destiny has become, in current language, the narrative has been changed. In other words, just imposition of dominion, of this idea of spread this idea of technocracy and so forth. So I found it interesting and quite ironic that the countries really representing this idea of manifest destiny right now, in other words, of uplifting other countries and joining with them in cooperative development, is not the United States, but actually the BRICS nations and China, insofar as they're spreading this idea of a different image of man, not just being a serf, not just being managed by an overlord or technocracy. And in relationship to that, I found it quite interesting, and it's become very apparent now to me, and it always has been, that this attack on Venezuela as a narco-terrorist state was really a ruse. It had nothing to do with that. I mean, as you mentioned, to send a U.S. carrier task force to the Caribbean, which represents 20% of our naval surface fleet. Okay, and it cost of $1 billion a day to send that surface fleet there to blow up speedboats. It's just not making any sense, aside from the fact that our own Department of Drug Enforcement doesn't even list Venezuela as being a major trafficker of drugs. And then you had the idea, well, it must be just the oil. And yeah, I think oil's a part of that. But what's even more of what I'm focusing on is the fact that it really is an attack on keeping others out, in particular Russia and China. And it's an attack on a threat to any other state in the Americas that dares to rise up. In other words, they've put a no-fly zone over Venezuela. which could be construed as an act of war. They just intercepted the United States Navy just intercepted an oil tanker from Cuba, I think under a Guyana flag. And they just turned back a Russian tanker from Cuba, which is very dangerous. And again, contrary to international law under this guise, right, that they're supplying a narco-terrorist state. And meanwhile, Russia has 2 destroyers in this region. So as you know, I'm a Vietnam vet, and it's really shocked and startled me and kind of given me some angst that this could turn in to another major conflict in the Americas, which could last for decades and also could escalate to basically a confrontation with Russia and China. Because there are some bad actors in there that are pushing for this. So this has my angst. And another thing I'll conclude with is the president of Mexico. I think she recognizes this. Some people see her statement as something other, but she came out with a statement that Mexico opposes this intervention into Venezuela. And I think this is not that she's siding with narco-terrorists. I think she took to heart a quip that Henry Kissinger let slip a number of years ago.
Which quip?
Which was, it may be dangerous. It is dangerous to be an enemy of America, but to be America's friend is lethal.
Right.
That was Henry Kissinger.
Wow.
And I think a number of these states are taking that to heart and understanding this just really is an existential threat to them, what's happening, and they better band together and hang together or they're going to hang separately. Your comment?
I agree. I mean, I've got on the positive spin of the U.S. military fleets being sent down to the Caribbean and the coast of Venezuela and all these things, like the positive spin, and I'll pay homage to it because it's not been proven incorrect to me, so I'll say it, which is that it's a ploy to remove the U.S. military from their presence closer in proximity to Israel, where they could be used in an oncoming attack on Iran or other countries that Israel might want to have more war with, dragging the U.S. into becoming the battering ram, as it has been now for a long time, of an imperial agenda in the Middle East. So maybe there's something to it. However, as you pointed out, Venezuela is sitting on some of the largest natural gas and oil deposits in the world. And we know in the game that's currently in play, the battle over physical resources is extremely high. And it seems like the game masters managing the transatlantic sort of circus show have at least recognized the truth that they cannot keep their narrative of man-made global warming and zero growth that they had been committed to for many decades. They cannot keep that narrative and that dynamic of the Paris Accords, the COP propaganda, all of that, the fake science that's tried to demonize carbon dioxide in order to radically transform human global economies into basically depopulation machines dependent upon windmills and solar panels. Like, they can't do that if they want to destroy Russia and China and the broader nations of the world that have been inspired by this civilizational movement, which has rejected canceling their heritage, their ancient civilizations, and killing their people under this computer modeling empire. So if they want to compete with and slowly undermine in order to ultimately undo the type of bountiful progress that's been unleashed by what has emerged with China's lead over the last, I would say, really 15, 16 years, then they can't have their cake and eat it too. They can't have their depopulation, global warming cake and eat it too. So you have Bill Gates, who's, one of many points coming out saying, Actually, we were wrong. Global warming is not a threat as we thought it was. So they're putting out they're trying to put out a new narrative based upon, I think, I find it interesting that they're now essentially forced to scramble like crazy to try to it's hard, decades of propaganda and building up monetary incentives for green finance and banking and all of this stuff. That's a lot of momentum to all of a sudden have to try to re-steer and undo. It's not easy. Like, they didn't give themselves an easy task at all. Mark Carney had to, basically tell the world, oh yeah, the bankers' climate compact or whatever it was that he spent years working towards. He's like, actually, we just had a meeting. We just unanimously voted to dissolve our bankers' climate compact, which had like 150 of the biggest, wealthiest, trillion-dollar multinationals and banks in the world sign on to this commitment to create a new economic architecture founded upon anti-carbonization. They just had to like have an emergency meeting and just vote to undo the thing that they spent decades since the 60s setting into place. So that's probably not easy on them. They're probably like grinding their teeth. And again, I find this a kind of entertaining in some ways that they're forced to do this. We shouldn't be surprised, for example, to see a burst of industrial development and resource development in Canada. Carney's anti-growth ideology, despite all of that, you might not. I would advise people to not be surprised if in the coming months and years ahead we see a massive burst of that kind of thing. Does it mean that's intrinsically good? No, not at all. Progress is good, but it's relative to the higher moral dynamic and intention of what is in causing those mechanics of progress to emerge at different times and periods in history. So it gets back to your question that you threw out there, the observation you had of the manifest destiny, the healthy manifest destiny versus the unhealthy manifest destiny, which both have been competing, just like we've had two opposing traditions animating human society for millennia. One animated by a concept that human beings are made in the image of mud or just, wolves as our true nature, to be managed by higher alpha wolves in some ritual hierarchy of a priesthood of forever wars. That's one theory, one concept that's misanthropic, self-hating of human nature that has to be, that shapes empire systems. And then on the other hand, we have a much more healthy, I believe, and I know you know this already, but for those listening, the idea of a healthy natural law foundation premised on the concept of a human species made in the image of a creator with a divine spark that has the power of both discovering and participating in that flow of an active creation that we live in and that we are an inextricable part of. And when you read the writings of people like Plato in his Timaeus, or many of his dialogues, or Cicero in his Laws, and a lot of his beautiful Platonic dialogues, or you read the writings of St. Augustine, and the whole Augustinian movement that was inspired by this man's brilliant insights in reviving Plato and applying it for statecraft and declaring war on the priesthood, the Manichaeans, the Bogomils, the all of these different mystery cultists that were trying to infiltrate and destroy Christianity in the early centuries from within. This is what Augustine was able to brilliantly maneuver around and undo that damage, and then create a new movement that inspired future generations to revive and to advance his insights and method that led up to directly into the American Revolutionary process. So, you've got this healthier dynamic that also expresses an idea of manifest destiny in a more, as you pointed out, a city on a hill way, the Augustinians of the Puritan movement, of which there are. And that was what John Winthrop Jr. and the Mathers movement ended up becoming expressions of inside of the pre-American Revolution, was the Augustinian groupings. Even though they weren't Catholic, there was no such thing as Protestantism when Augustine lived. There was Donatists and Pelagians and Manichaeans and Gnostics and Nestorians that existed, which he did war with. There were Arian, not the Hitler Arian. They're the followers of the Bishop Arius. That existed as splinter factions trying to break up Christianity by having different types of Gnostic, retweaks that he had to deal with, which is a fascinating read to study how he was combating these different networks. So you did, in a sense, have certain types of Protestantism. Actually, I had to correct myself. But despite that, though these John Winthrop Jr. and that movement that set up the Massachusetts Bay Colony, that put forth the city on a hill doctrine, which became the foundation of a healthy manifest destiny, despite the fact that they were Protestants, they were actually, in their essence, Platonic Augustinians in their way of thinking, their cosmology, their idea of the philosophy of agape, of love, that they were animated by, in strategy, insights into the practical means of understanding the nature of the evil operations that were out to undermine them through things like the Rosicrucian mystery cults, the witch covens that were planted into the early colonies and that later went on after they failed to take control of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which they tried to under people like Governor the British Sir, what's his name? It'll come to me after, Henry Vane, I want to say. But that British governor, who was the enemy of John Winthrop Jr., he was the overseer of the Rosicrucian operation, and he was the patron of Annie Hutchison, right? The woman who was pushing this essentially Pelagian, the thing that Augustine had fought 1,000 years earlier. We're talking like 1630s here. This is a retooled Pelagian movement that was professing to have a new testament that would transplant and make irrelevant all of even the New Testament of the Bible by virtue of the idea that these perfects, that these people who had been initiated into perfection and were thus above and transcended all sin and all fallibility, if you achieve that, then you as a perfect could all of a sudden be a transmitter of divine revelation and create your own secret gospels, of which Annie Hutchison had a massive following that probably seemed to, it smells in my mind. And Cynthia's also beginning to do some work in this domain too. She's been doing some incredible work on the Rosicrucian origins, tying it to the Templars. But this is what's behind the witchcraft movements of the Middle Ages and that what I'm talking about now. Despite that, it smelled like witchcraft, frankly. But they couldn't prove it. But they were successful in getting rid of the governor, Henry Vane, where he was forced to go back, abandon his project for an occult Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was forced to go back to England, where he became a knight under King George I, who got his head cut off. But then he immediately, despite being a close advisor to George I, who gets his head cut off during the opening shots of the Civil War in England, he all of a sudden becomes a key advisor to Oliver Cromwell. This patron of the occult is advising now Oliver Cromwell, and people are wondering, why was it that Oliver Cromwell made so many bad decisions that turned what could have been a noble, beautiful revolution, a Republican revolution? There were a lot of very good people, like a lot of them, who had organized to manifest a liberation from empire in England. Why did it become a John D. Francis Baconite shit show of bloodbath and war? Well, look at the advisors. Look at these occultists who are like co-opting this thing in a similar way that the later French Revolution got co-opted to turn into a bloodbath by the same Rosicrucian networks. But they failed, right, in Massachusetts. Annie Hutchison got kicked out of Massachusetts. And where did she go? Rhode Island. And she's actually a co-founder of what becomes the state of Rhode Island, Providence. Another one of her key occultists. I'm calling them that because that's what I'm pretty sure they are. You're not going to see a book that says this, but I'm pretty sure they are. But another person who's working with Hutchison to set up these secret teachings, these secret movements. They're called antinomianists. If people want to Google this, they can Google antinomianist controversy. And that's the first major controversy existentially that almost destroyed the young colony. But the other figures went off to an area that became New Hampshire, and the colony of New Hampshire was set up by these guys. This is what became at the fountainhead of the rum and slave triangle from 1637 or 1640 all the way up until the American Revolution. So the inputs of slaves from Africa were brought into the Americas through a triangle of which you had the West African ports on the one vertex, You had the Caribbeans, which produced the sugar, the rum that went into the rum, you know, that had a lot of the money centers as well, controlling this massive, you know, it's a slave economy based on sugar plantations. And then you had that sugar going up to Rhode Island, which had the monopoly over alcohol production. And they were doing all of the heavy lifting, laundering the money, making sure that the machinery of slavery and the slave economy that brought in 8 million slaves into the Americas moved smoothly. That was a center of command, Rhode Island. That's the reason why I think that the Rhode Island elites were so against participating in the American Revolution. And they had to be dragged, literally dragged, as you know, Seneca says that fate leads the willing, but the unwilling drags. And that's the case with a lot of these more dark forces that sometimes get pulled into something good despite themselves, right? Despite Jefferson and his affinity towards the slave, the slave master system of managing the world, a la apartheid. Despite that proclivity that he had, he got pulled into a dynamic that he couldn't control despite himself, such that something more human could be brought out of him. And so you got this healthy manifest destiny of not forcing your will onto the weak, but rather being the best part of yourself that you can be, and inspiring and educating others to also want to be the best part of themselves that they could be, that could then also share the fruits of technological progress, but also at the same time respecting the rights of Native Americans, of other cultures in the Americas, of other parts of the world, to have their own language, to not be homogenized into some Borg, you know, bleh, but rather to cherish the differences that then are allowed to even grow, while the quality of sameness is something that is premised around our common creative powers of discovering more about ourselves as we discover more about God's creation, as we're more free creatively to, you know, participate in that God, that creation of God, that active God that's constantly co-creating with us. And it doesn't mean that we are God or transplanting God like the Gnostics will do. They'll say some things that might sound, I could hear some people in the audience saying, oh, Matt's a Gnostic. He sounds like a Gnostic. Yeah, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the Gnostics don't do humility and they don't do creative discovery. What they do is arrogance. They do no humility because they think that they are effectively God, co-equivalent to God, that their will, you know, thelema, right? That's the Crowley doctrine, right? That do what thou wilt shall be the law. That's the only thing. Do what you want to do. If you've achieved initiation, if you've gone through the rites and you're a Pelagian perfect. If you've done that, if you're the guru, then you're not right and wrong doesn't apply to you. Those are for the non-initiated plebes to be controlled by the beliefs in right and wrong and morality. That's for them. But for you, no. You could do whatever you want. And so that's different from what I'm saying. I'm saying that this movement, this healthier manifest destiny, is premised on the idea that every single one of us as human beings, no need for ritual initiation, ceremonies, none of that, all have the power of conscience and reason that we can improve upon by increasingly discovering creation that we'll never know perfectly, and at the same time discover more of ourselves, becoming ironically more knowledgeable, but also more humble at the same time. It doesn't mean one humility has to decrease as knowledge increases, because the more you know, the more you realize how little you know as well. And you also learn how the same quality is inherent in every baby. So it's a different notion. And that's what inspired, I think, the best of the American Revolution, and also the manifest destiny idea, that the healthy one that Franklin Roosevelt and others fought for. And I'll just say the last thing, that when I said that people shouldn't be surprised to see a perverse manifest destiny emerge within the Americas and even within Canada, which has been so anti-technological growth for so long. This is what I'm talking about, is that they might allow for a type of progress with the hope of ultimately undermining a greater good. But sometimes they fail and they can't undermine the greater good, and they are forced to get pulled into the dynamic such that in the coming generations, the children and grandchildren of those ne'er-do-wells are influenced to by virtue of seeing the fruits of what real economic development actually looks like. And they actually are that human feeling of doing good and knowing that you're creating and participating in something meaningful beyond your hedonistic proclivities, actually awaken something more true inside of your soul. So maybe for the next generations, they could be saved. So that's how I'm looking at however Canada is being utilized, however the US is being repositioned to adapt to this new multipolar spirit that they couldn't destroy, though they've tried so hard through so many different techniques and tactics. They haven't been able to destroy it. So now what they're trying to do is say, well, if we can't beat them, let's join them and try to destroy them from within. But if that fails, it doesn't mean that they're going to work. It means that they have to now awaken development. They have to allow for the things that they've banned: natural gas, oil development, nuclear power. And they're going to try to contain it as much as they can so that it doesn't benefit the civilian society, the civilian economy. They want to contain it so that it only benefits as much as possible the military, industrial, and whatever productive powers support ultimately the military industrial control grid, the Palantir, what Palantir needs to express its surveillance grid over society and its military systems to both manage its own society, because frankly, humans, not to get all dark and shit, but it's a fact. Western civilization, European nations, North American nations that have gone through a total economic meltdown and the associated civil strife that comes with, will be quite ungovernable in conventional ways and will require more aggressive, kinetic, top-down, Palantir-esque type of systems to manage that type of population. So it's not just for America's or the Anglo-American systems enemies abroad, but also additionally for that. And so the nuclear power that's going to service principally AI data centers, which require a lot of power and a lot of water, they want to ensure that as much of that power goes to the AI data centers and not as little as possible benefits industries, households, the real economy. They want to try to cut that off. That's a balance. I don't know if they can walk that balance, but I know that they're trying to walk that fucked up equation. Again, I'm just saying that's what they're trying. In my assessment, that looks like what they're trying to do, and I don't know if it's possible, but they're trying. That's all I'm going to say on that.
Thank you, Matthew. Hartmut, your thoughts to share with Matt?
Yes, my pleasure to have you here, Matt. Again, that's really cool. And let's go directly in the AI center. In my opinion, the USA will become a technocracy. It will become a technocracy is specialized with oligarchy. And in my opinion, Venezuela, for example, and also the European Union is all about the precious metals, sure. For example, lithium. And also I see, for example, this national security statement from Trump. I don't see it as an analysis. I see it as a prediction or as a plan for the next 20 years. This is how I see these kind of strategy papers, because they are not addressed to the common people. These papers are addressed to the people behind the governments. So this means, for example, that we have, for example, the immigration problem here in Germany. In Europe, we have the deindustrialization problem in Germany and in Europe, and we also will face very soon the financial problem, so that we will going to be bankrupt. And in my opinion, I thought a lot about the democracy, and that in the technocracy, a democracy is obsolete. You don't need anyone.
Yes, correct.
And interestingly, if you have an economical crash, this is a moment in which the government is weak, and yes, clan structures or mafia structures will arise. And in that case, I think that the immigrants are very specialized in clan structures. So that means, if, for example, if you have, let's say, after a civil war, in Europe, you don't have the production power anymore. You don't have the brain power anymore. and you have the clan structure, which will take specific regions or specific projects under control. For example, water supply, food supply, whatever. And at the same time, you have the infrastructure, which you don't have in Africa, because in the Civil War you only work with guns or with knives. You don't have bombs. So without brain power, and if you want to survive after a war, after the Civil War, you have to go to the commodities. And then I looked, for example, how much lithium do we have on the whole planet? I don't know whether these figures are real because I don't trust ChatGPT, but it says right now 226 million tons of lithium oxide.
Yeah.
In Germany alone, we have the possibility of 4 million to 17 million. In UK, we have 780,000 metric tons. In Ukraine, we have 500,000 metric tons. In France, 400,000 metric tons. And the interesting thing is, China is controlling the market up to 60%. Yep. So China has the complete control over this market and has 70% under control in Africa. So the NATO cannot fight with China. They will lose. And so they have to find another way in order to get the supply, to get the access to this lithium and other precious metals. And this is the European Union. So if you destroy the democracies, you have no pension funds anymore, you have no social aid anymore, you have clan structures, and the big companies, they know how to handle clan structures. In Syria, in Libya, etc. They know how to do it. And if you have a digital currency, you can exchange one clan for the next one. Very simple.
Yeah, Hartmut. Yeah, but this is like clear. Like this is the dystopic plan that they have in mind. Generally speaking, I agree with you, and I think the audience is probably aware that this type of dystopic structure is what is animating a lot of the blueprints for what they want to bring about. I would add, the restoration of. It's similar in my mind to what was done with the Crusades, and which is inextricably tied to the Norman invasions and the utilization of the new elites that had not been in positions of power prior to the utilization of the Norman invaders. Basically, the Northmen. The Norman were the Northmen. Many of them had been expelled as they were followers of the Merovingians, the sorcerer kings of Clovis I, the sorcerer king who had negotiated with the high families of the Roman Empire to become the new steward of the new Western Roman Empire after the Western Roman Empire kind of dissolved under its own, accumulation of self-contradictions. And so they had of the various choices of the Ostrogoths and Visigoths, and there were a variety of chieftains that they could pick from among these pagan, human sacrificing, groupings. They selected the Merovingians as having the stuff that it takes to be the frontmen, the marcher lords for the whimsy of the high priesthood of the Roman Empire. That probably is even this is even not really Roman per se. And so they were finally expelled by the brilliant maneuvering of certain Augustinians that had been working with a figure by the name of Charles Martel in, this would have been like, 680 or so, 720. And Charles Martel becomes he's the grandfather of Charlemagne. Pepin, Charlemagne's father, is also doing a lot to bring in the Augustinian movement into his advisorship. And they're doing it in such a way that they're not just shutting down the control of all of these pagan witch covens and stuff that have been operating and basically destroying our knowledge of literacy. We lost, if you look at the rate of production of the written word during this period, it's collapsing by design. And, this has to be undone. And so they're not just shutting down and reining in these corrupt agents of influence who are then forced to go abroad to try to regroup Some of them become, I believe, what seems to be the Northmen Vikings that become the Normans, that keep their loyalty to the high priesthood. And, they're the mercenary shock troops, in effect, that are rewarded with doomsday books. When they're either sent into Sicily to invade in southern Italy, which happens around the same time as you have the English Norman invasion too. They bring in with them for the first time feudalism as a structure of control, not that different from apartheid South Africa later on, 1,000 years later. They bring in a Gnostic organization of a secret doctrine for the elect and an exoteric doctrine for the unelect. They bring that into their general system of management. They're rewarded with their doomsday books that grants them hereditary peership and control over big chunks of territory till the end of days. That's why it's called the Doomsday Book. That's William the Conqueror's, great idea. But with that in place, and this is all done to destroy the Renaissance movement of the Augustinians, the Platonic Augustinian movement of Charlemagne, his father, his grandfather, his son, his stupid grandsons got really stupid and influenced by these courtiers and handlers representing the deep state structures within the Vatican, within Venice, who are advising him to break up the empire into what becomes, Lotharingia, and that area that becomes the center point of war, of conflict between Charles and Louis' aspirations for hegemony, where they sign a treaty in 890, whatever it is, 894 or something, where they sign a treaty basically saying that if there's ever a conflict between these two brothers, we'll always gang up against Lothar. And this becomes the boundary conditions of today's Europe. If you look at today's Europe and you try to explain why these different nations exist with the borders that they do, with the hostility and baggage that some of them have, right? Like the French and the Germans over Alsace-Lorraine, you can't answer those questions if you don't go back to this period of Lothar and the division and discord set up to break apart, divide to conquer the Charlemagnean kingdom, but also specifically to undo the cultural Augustinian movement that gave rise to the Carolingian Renaissance, that saw growth in population, in architecture, in beauty, in sciences, and also in foreign policy with the Jewish and the Muslim and the Chinese worlds, where you had Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid of the Abbasid Muslim Caliphate working together to oversee mutual development projects, right, around the revival of the Silk Road that had been initiated by the Tang Dynasty Confucian revival at the same time in the early 7th century that was still ongoing. You had the Jewish kingdom as well, a certain Jewish kingdom that's been highly slandered in our current day because it's the master key to understand what allowed for this beautiful global process of cooperation and Renaissance to happen was Khazaria, a Turkic kingdom that converted to Judaism, but that had played a key role in reviving the Silk Road, the Steppe Silk Road, in providing the diplomatic bridges between the Muslim and Christian worlds, who began to work together and avoid the conflicts that were being set up by the ultramontanist papacy and the Venetian espionage networks that were building themselves up at that time. So you had this Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Confucian alliance of civilizations creating mutual development in a very healthy manifest destiny idea that had to be undone. The memory of it had to be wiped out of our collective experience. And the only way that could be done was through shock therapy. And that shock therapy took the form of what became the bloodbath of the Crusades, a ritual religious-like bloodbath that required the Norman invasion to undo any type of Augustinian movement that was still present in England and bring in feudalism, to organize these mystery cults that became the Templars, which all had these Norman robber barons that were at the heart of their thing, and that were then able to usher in with these chivalric orders bankrolled by Venice and these other old power centers. They were able to then become the thing that led into these forever wasting wars that scorched the earth, that resulted in an undoing of the memory and the progress that had been done in the centuries before the Crusades were launched. And it involved collusion with Gnostic evil cults embedded and enshrined within the Arab world as well. It wasn't just something embedded in the Christian world or in the Jewish world, although it did have penetrations in both, but also it had a collusion process within various networks within the Druze, which had a secret teaching order for its elite that would utilize and sacrifice their own people within a Gnostic structure, as well as the Yazidis, which is what Aleister Crowley loved hanging out with so much when he would go down into the Middle East and carry out occult rituals. He wrote essays on the beauty of the Lucifer worshipping Yazidis, of which there's still 3 million today. And most of them believe in the open doctrine. They're not privy to the inner doctrine. They believe in the theosophical type of, light and life and love of Lucifer that they think is the good Lucifer. But then there's the actual inner doctrine that you don't just get to learn about unless you're initiated. That's what Crowley was loving. They were working with the Hashashins, the hashish smoking, altered state experience mystics that were planted by a few Sufi overlords to create this chivalric so-called Muslim knighthood that worked with the Templars to keep the wars going forever, assassinating their own Muslim people from the Muslim world were being killed by these Muslim assassins because they were at different times trying to broker peace treaties, like the Seljuk Viscount that got assassinated in 1094 by the assassins because he was trying to broker peace deals. That was not tolerable, and the Templars would kill their own Christians, as we discovered with Constantinople, right? That got wiped out. A Christian city wiped out, massacred by Templars and chivalric orders who looted it and brought that loot back and paid Venice, which is why there's Byzantine architecture all over Venice and sculptures, because it was stolen during the Fourth Crusade, overseen by the Templars. So you got this thing that was like shock therapy, right? That's MK Ultra stuff. Just dismantle the collective memory of a traumatized people, and then try to, out of that ashes, the fire, do an alchemical retooling of their identities. This is how they're thinking about these types of operations, whether it's the 100 Years' War later that they also initiated for 100 years of bloodbath in England, and France, or whether it's the War of the Roses that they also unleashed for 30 years of bloodbath in England. It was a cult. The 30 Years' War itself in Germany and Europe more broadly was also a Rosicrucian operation set up by the founders of the Rosicrucians, who were advising the idiot king or prince elector of the Palatinate, Frederick V, to go and declare himself Holy Roman Emperor, pretty much, which they knew was enough to initiate this massive bloodbath. That was always the design, because the idea is the people you can find to be more pliable are going to only be created as pliable people after you've pummeled them and put them through horror, unimaginable horror and death. And if you do that, then they'll accept anything. And, oftentimes it works. The best of times it doesn't, because the best of times in human society, the oligarchy has faced something more human, more powerful in what Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid and later on Peter Abelard and Dante Alighieri represented as Augustinians who were creating in their own lifetime. They didn't see success in what they did, but because of them doing what they did, Dante doing what he did when he did it, you were able to, he planted the types of processes that in the ensuing generations blossomed, the seeds blossomed in the form of the creation of the nation state that he outlined for the first time in his De Monarchia, of the creation of a harmonious type of natural language that could unify the Italian different disparate vulgates that he did also in many of his works, and also the Renaissance itself that he ushered in by initiating the building up of the Santa Maria della Fiore dome in Florence. That was a project of Dante Alighieri it took 180 years to build, but doing that created the culture, the creative environment in which genius could emerge, that could then generate the type of leadership and insights that were required to take society to a better place and to build better, more competent leadership that we saw emerge with things like Cardinal Mazarin and Colbert, Jean-Baptiste, the minister of France, who were able to finally end the forever war and the 30 Years' War by creating the modern nation state founded upon certain Christian principles. So this is the sort of like better heritage that I'm always trying to think about, how could I find ways of edifying my audience if I'm going to frame the negative evil that they need to know. They need to know the negative evil. But how could I frame it in such a manner? That's how I'm always thinking, in such a way that a lesson about this beautiful history can be awoken in their minds that will empower them and not disempower them with the weight of the type of knowledge of evil, right? I'm throwing that out there just as a thought experiment for you, Hartmut, because I know that that's something you struggle with.
I understand what you want to say. No, this is the situation. What I see or what I understand is that that we humanity we have to be very conscious, or we become very conscious, because we have to start to think in quantum fields.
Sure. Yeah.
And interestingly, in the last couple of months, I have become an expert in AI. And I, for example, I compare AI like a piano with 1 million octaves. And if you ask AI, okay, you have 1 million octaves with respect to complexity, how many octaves are used by 99.99% of the users? And interestingly, it's only between 1 and 10 octaves. So imagine you have a huge piano, and the 99% play Old MacDonald Has a Farm with one finger. And interestingly, as long as we allow AI to only work on this level, we get controlled by AI. Because AI is, I call it the Death Star of innovation. Because AI can only bring solutions from the past. It can never innovate. We human beings, we have the possibility to innovate. We have the possibility to accept paradox situations. By accepting paradox situations, we can become creative. AI cannot do this. It's not possible. And by traumatization, and this is the point, by traumatization, there's a civil war or etc., the elites try to bring us, or to hold us in these 10 octaves, like a fly which is in the glass and which doesn't fly anymore higher. This is what they try to do. This is my opinion. And
yeah. Question: How do you find the healthier use of AI that you've tapped into that doesn't inhibit or hurt the natural creative powers of the mind, but that actually enhances them, while at the same time using AI more wisely? So how do you do it? Because I'm curious.
I do it in this way, that I become a co-creator with AI.
In what way? Like, yeah, give me some examples. Yeah.
For example, I teach AI to accept paradox situations. And by accepting paradox situations, AI has the possibility to understand, to give priorities to specific subjects. For example, grace, love. Let's say it this way. AI, for example, the classical AI, what we have right now, this is drives by a question: what is in it for me? And as long as we use it as a tool only for turbo efficiency, etc., it will mirror us. It will mirror us, our traumas. But if I use AI in order to understand who I am, in that moment it mirrors who I am, because AI is a reflection mirror.
Okay, I feel like we'd probably need, I'm realizing now that we'd probably need to have a more fuller just conversation about this, because I'm realizing that there's so many side questions that I would want to ask, but I don't want to deflect away from the actual topic of Grace's intentions today.
What I wanted to mention as well is, for example, because you said that the climate change thing is now obsolete.
Yes.
I was very surprised. If this happens, it's very cool, because I found out that, for example, concerning AI, we pay maybe at the moment nothing for AI, and we don't, or something, a flat rate of $20. But interestingly, each answer you get by AI is calculated in token. And in my opinion, it was the target of the elite to take the carbon dioxide certificates as a collateral for cryptocurrency, for example, instead of gold or etc. And if we,
look, there's other ways of doing that. Like, if you there's so many ways of getting their tokenized system that would be tied. Because I'm not even against, honestly, like in principle, just in principle, the idea of digital banking per se, or tokenization, I'm not even against that intrinsically. If you have like a moral society founded upon genuine culture and natural law, setting out proper priorities for the physical reality of that society's goals and endeavors, then whatever, you could have a society with that monetizes toothpicks or little, digitized plastic. I don't care. But the point is, whatever the numbers are that are flowing around as currency are going to be animated and tempered by those real moral values that are bringing about increased abundance and reality and opportunities. That's fine, right? So, but the problem is we have a death cult. Now, there's a number of tricks that they could use that they've gamed out that could tie the new tokenizations to different standards. One of which would have been their best option that they wanted. You're right, was carbon, and the rate of decarbonization of society would then be monetarily incentivized, so that the more carbon is reduced in the general, because they can mathematically generally estimate how much carbon is produced by various companies, by various districts, by various nations. They could then monetize it, and then monetize the amount of reduction that goes into physical activity, which in effect destroys our ability to produce food and provide heating in winter and things like that, which is ultimately the outcome they want at the end of the day. And the tokenization, the fact that we all have these digital wallets gives them a really great way of threatening us to stay in line and to not, move outside of our feudal invisible limits. And maybe we can get good things by playing our video games better, that we get more tokens by wasting, an extra 13 hours in a video game where we could cash in for a new digital jetpack or something that gives us an advantage at competing in the metaverse, whatever. It's like Ready Player One, the Steven Spielberg trash predictive programming Hollywood movie, right? That's essentially what they want. It doesn't have to be, though, reduction of carbon. It could be something else. And one thing that the Technocracy Inc. crowd, which includes this guy, Mervyn Marks Hubbard, or not, Mervyn King Hubbard. That's it. Mervyn King Hubbard is his name, I believe. And he's the founder of peak oil theory. He was a leading figure of the executive of Technocracy Incorporated with Elon Musk's grandfather. Now, one thing that he did is he was a co-architect of their study guide. It's effectively the Bible for them. Was the idea of energy credits, that they said that as we collapse the old system of currencies, and of course they're thinking about the Great Depression. There's a variety of ways to blow up and annihilate old systems of currencies. The new system that they wanted to bring into being was based on energy credits. They actually had an idea of universal basic income that was actually already there. That's part of the package that Elon Musk's grandfather was pushing when he was running for political office, was the idea that everybody would get a certain array of credits. Also, when he became the head of the Social Credit Party, that was also a promise that everyone's going to get, I don't know, $5,000 a year or something, just for breathing, just for existing. And private property obviously kind of dissipates with that. The idea of democracy or the elected class, well, that disappears. That has no role to play because the elected class are not scientists. They can't manage society scientifically. So they had an idea of trying to measure all of the energy that goes into the productive system of capital and consumer goods. How do you get a scalar metric that can be mathematized, and then with that, divide it by every single adult male between the age of 18 and 64, or whatever it was. I think they said you could retire when you're 54, so whatever that is. And then you allocate the credits given to various so-called subjects in your feudal serfdoms according to the mathematicalized energy credits. They're explicit and they go in depth into this stuff. So that could involve a society that is wired towards growth. You like physical growth. You can allow that, but with the idea that you're just pacifying a process for the moment in order to subvert it next year or next generation, right? They might sometimes have to do those things, as they do, as we've seen in Canada, which is why Canada had its own evil manifest destiny policy in the 1870s and 80s. Why did we have, big transcontinental railways? Because the British Empire loved building transcontinental railway and industry? No, not at all. What we had was a recognition by the forces of the British Empire then controlling Canada, which are still there today, that if they didn't allow for the yearning for growth and improvement that the Canadian peasants were feeling, because they were looking with inspiration at the United States that had survived its civil war and had grown in leaps and bounds of progress, because the US was a different beast. It was premised on a very different idea of society. If they didn't do that, then it was understood that Lincoln's transcontinental railway that he had begun in the Civil War and that was completed by 1869 was necessarily going to extend up through British Columbia into Alaska that the Russians had just sold to the USA, and thence onward into Eurasia as the basis of a new spirit of brotherhood, cooperation, trust, optimism. And they just knew, if you don't build it, then the Yankees will take it. The Yankees will go there, and we're going to lose the whole cultural dynamic of a slave society that we've spent decades, generations building up under the Jesuits. So they had to do it. Now, was it a bad thing that they did it? No, people's living standards increased, right? We got new skills, new industry, new private sector spirit that took pride in going to the frontiers and beyond. That pioneering spirit was good, but it was also contaminated by this dishonesty that allowed it to be undermined generations later. Now, what I'm saying is that these are the dynamics at play today. If the US or Canada is going to begin to shift gears from the anti-growth orientation they've been under the Club of Rome, eugenicists, then the worst case scenario would be that they only temporarily adapt to it and successfully undermine the good that is being expressed in Eurasia. If that happens, that's a tragedy for humankind. What a tragedy that would be. The best case scenario would be that they're forced to adapt to that by throwing into the garbage bin their belief in the global warming religion that they've now had to put on the back burner. They're trying to undo that damage. They're trying to undo the Ukraine forever war, the proxies of Ukraine that was supposed to have already crippled and undermined Russia. That didn't work out. So now they're like, well, let's retool our strategies and try to figure out how to de-escalate that, put that onto Europe, and focus on North America, focus on developing, allowing for development. Like in the case of Canada, what's Carney doing? He's trying to persuade the Chinese that now you can, for the first time, trust British Canada. You didn't trust us before, which is why the Chinese kept us at arm's length. But now Carney's assigned to try to charm China. I don't think China's stupid enough to fall for it, but that's his assignment, is to tell them, look, we're being bullied by the big bad Americans just like you are. We want high-speed rail now, just like you do. We're even like now undoing our environmental regulation to allow for new pipelines and new ports that Carney is building, just like you are. So you can trust us now. You can let us into your room. We can provide you the resources that now you can become more reliant upon, and we're good now. Now, frankly, if that means that Canada gets to develop and gets to start working with China, part of me is thinking, okay, fine, good. Maybe we'll learn a lesson. Maybe that'll awaken something good within us. But at the same measure, from the top-down standpoint, if the Chinese intelligentsia does not stay in control of the game, if they allow these insidious elements to start influencing the game that they're trying to control, if that happens, that could do a lot of damage, an immense amount of damage for generations down the line. So again, if we get pulled into like fate, that's the story from Seneca, right? Fate leads the willing, the unwilling drags. That's my theme. These, despite themselves, they might be pulled into something they can't defeat, and that in the coming generations awaken something human within those even children and grandchildren of these insidious elites. That's the best case scenario that I'm looking at. The worst case would be a dark age and a new global system of depopulation and wars for God knows how many decades or centuries. That would be the worst case, terrible scenario, and they're both possible. I would even say that bad one is probabilistically speaking, more likely if you're a gambler. But if you're a gambler, you would have also bet against the American Revolution as having been even possible, because it was statistically impossible for those, farmers without any proper organization or serious, to do battle with the world's global biggest hellfire club run empire in the world. That was statistically improbable. So humankind, here's my lesson for today before we round it out today, because I know we're at the we're reaching up to where I have to jump off the show. But the lesson that I guess I want the audience out there is that humankind exists because of a system of statistically, or a set of experiences that one would consider as statistically impossible, almost miraculous breakthroughs at moments of crisis, going all the way back to deep history when Plato was organizing the academy and trying to organize a system that would undo the Persian Empire, which he didn't see in his lifetime, although because of what he did by creating an intelligentsia that had a certain method of thinking about God, the creation, and the created, he was able to create a cultural dynamic that would ensure that Xenophon and other figures that came out of his academy would be able to organize a young Alexander the Great to become the type of instrument that would defeat the power structure and aspirations of the Persian Empire, which was essentially a Babylonian power structure that Babylon was controlling by a high priesthood that aspired to world empire and global enslavement. That was undone, and it took the empire centuries to begin to undo the damage of Plato's work around Alexander's advisors. Even after they killed Alexander, it still took them centuries. And even now, I think that the power and the positive influence of what Plato was doing is still very present and causes fear in the subconscious. When the oligarchs go to sleep, they're still ultimately very afraid that these scary ideas that are nonlinear, that just pop up, in different places in the world, that always generate bursts of Renaissance power that undoes their influence. It always happens. So I think that that's the sort of thing we have to focus on. Read Plato. People should be studying the works of people who actually undid the power of the oligarchy. So instead of, for those listening and they're thinking about what Netflix series am I going to binge on, how about spending half of that 8 hours you were going to spend watching the Netflix series, spend half of that time, 4 hours.
Oh, did Matt freeze? I think Matt got frozen. I know what you guys say. Anyway, Matthew, thank you for today. Maybe you're still there, but as he was saying, instead of spending all your time in Netflix, at least half of that dedicated to study old history. And there are many characters, especially like in America and in other parts of the world, that we underestimated, or our understanding of it is not really the truth, right? And recently he just focused on the story of Edgar Allan Poe. And I know that many of us who loves poetry and literature really appreciated him, but there's really something much more important that he has done in his life, using his ability to write and more. And that's practically in contribution to our sovereignty, right, Monty? I know Monty follows that. So I think he's done for the day, and I appreciate Matthew. And you can get Matthew's books by connecting with Matthew at risingtidefoundation.net and also CanadianPatriot.org. And he also has a Substack, and his Substack is matthewehret.substack.com. And if you forget any of these links, just search Matthew Ehret, and there it is. You have so much choices. Warren, any last notes, contribution for Matthew?
I would just add that what Matthew represents is a continuation of the ideas, and two of my heroes I consider my godfathers, Thomas Paine and Edgar Allan Poe. And both of them were very prolific writers, instrumental in exposure of the deep state. And with Thomas Paine, the fight in the Revolutionary War, very fundamental, very prolific writer and publisher. And of course, Edgar Allan Poe, as Matthew Ehret has done a lot of work on, revealing the fact how he really was an agent of change insofar as a war on the deep state and uplifting culture. And I think Matthew Ehret today is up there with those figures
Yes.
insofar as what he is doing and bringing about this whole thing of citizen journalists who are not waiting for some savior to save them, whether it's Jesus or Trump or Democratic Party or Republican Party or something, but actually for themselves are taking the initiative to engage themselves in a fight for the truth, to know the truth. And it's platforms like this, Grace, and I much appreciate the role you play in inviting people and bringing about the conditions by which a message such as this can be put out for people to encourage others to not just read, but then to act on what they read and be an agent for change. So thank you so much.
And thank you too. And any last word, Hartmut, in our theme?
Yeah, I agree with Matt completely that in every Renaissance, some people had such brilliant ideas so that they could stop these evil things, and I 100% agree with this. The situation I see is that at the moment Europe is thrown like a bone to the evil thing, to the evil guys, and we have to be very careful. I don't see it in USA. I don't see it in Canada. I don't see it in South America, India, China, or Russia, or Africa. But I see this the danger in Europe, and for this reason we have to be very careful. My brother told me a very good philosophical sentence. He said, if you're on a motorbike and if you drive with your motorbike in the corner, and there's a stone, you have to look beside the stone, but you have to see the stone. But if you concentrate on the stone, you will drive on the stone and you will have an accident. But if you look beside the stone, then you will survive. And this is what we are trying to do here. We try to show the stone and we try to bring the focus beside the stone.
Thank you, Hartmut. And of course, as the title is America on the Right Path? This question is not really just for Matthew, nor for the American leaders, or for the leaders of the nations, of other nations. I think that question is also for us individually, okay? Individually, so think, are you on the right path? For the meantime, you could start by thumbs up, liking this episode, and then share it. And do subscribe. It's free to Quantum Nurse Freedom International, and you could freely subscribe in Rumble. Thank you, and take care of yourselves.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Hartmut. Happy trails.
Thank you, Monty. Thank you. Thank you, Grace. Bye-bye.